Is this what your system calls ready? The question cut through the scorching midday air just as the C-130's engine coughed and fell silent again, a hollow metallic failure echoing across the tarmac, while heat shimmered off the concrete in waves that bent the horizon and blurred the outlines of men who suddenly didn't look so confident anymore as Ryan Brooks wiped sweat from his jaw and snapped at his team to rerun diagnostics. Their laptops glowing with clean green indicators that promised everything was fine while the aircraft sat, dead and unmoving like it had made its own decision to stop listening. And somewhere behind the cluster of uniforms and raised voices stood a man no one had invited into the moment, Ethan Caldwell, hands resting loosely at his sides, posture relaxed but unmoving, his faded olive jacket stirring slightly in the warm crosswind, as if he were standing in a different place entirely. His eyes not on the chaos, but fixed on a single section of the fuselage just below the engine cowling where the sunlight hit the metal at a slightly different angle. "We've got 15 minutes before command pulls the plug on this entire op," Ryan barked, his voice tight with pressure, the kind that comes from being watched by people who don't tolerate failure. Run it again. But the results didn't change, and the tension grew thicker, heavier, until someone noticed the old man and laughed. A quick, sharp sound that spread faster than it should have. "Hey, you lost, sir? Maintenance crew's that way." Another voice added, louder this time. "Or you just here for the show?" And a few chuckles followed, the kind that comes easy when confidence hasn't been challenged yet. But Ethan didn't respond, didn't even turn his head, just took a slow step forward, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound against the concrete, his gaze still locked on that same panel as if the noise around him didn't exist. "Open that," he said quietly, his voice low, steady, almost swallowed by the hum of idle equipment. But Ryan heard it and turned, irritation flashing across his face as he sized up the man in a single dismissive glance. "Excuse me." Ethan lifted his chin slightly. "Toward the panel. That one," he repeated, calm, certain, and for a brief second something in the air shifted, subtle enough that most missed it, but not all, because standing just off to the side, Airman Lucas Reed felt it, a flicker of something that didn't match the situation, the way the old man stood, the way he wasn't guessing. But Ryan scoffed, shaking his head as he stepped closer. "We already checked every inch of this aircraft," he said, tapping the tablet in his hand. "System says it's fine." And that was enough for the laughter to return, louder now, reinforced by certainty and numbers and modern precision. "Yeah. We'll just ignore the diagnostics and go with your gut, right?" someone muttered. But Ethan didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't try to prove anything. He just kept looking at the metal like he was listening to something no one else could hear, and the wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of hot steel and jet fuel, a familiar mix that seemed to settle into him rather than pass by. While Lucas watched closer now, unease creeping in, because there was something about the stillness, something about the way the old man didn't react to being dismissed, like he had already seen this moment play out before. And somewhere in the distance, the low growl of an approaching engine began to rise, unnoticed by most, but not by Ethan, whose eyes never left that panel as the seconds slipped away and the aircraft remained silent. The sound of the approaching engine grew louder, a deep, controlled rumble that did not belong to the chaos of the stalled aircraft but cut through it with purpose. And this time more heads turned as a black government SUV rolled onto the edge of the tarmac, tires crunching softly against loose gravel before coming to a precise stop, its presence quiet but heavy, like something important had just arrived without needing to announce itself. Yet Ryan Brooks barely spared it a glance, his focus locked on salvaging control of a situation that was slipping inch by inch through his fingers as the clock kept moving and the aircraft remained silent. "We do not have time for guesses," he said sharply, stepping closer to Ethan as if proximity alone would reassert authority. "This is a controlled operation, not some trial and error experiment." But Ethan did not move back, did not react to the tone. He simply shifted his gaze for the first time, not to Ryan, but to the line of bolts along the panel, his eyes tracing them slowly, deliberately, like he was reading something written beneath the surface. "It is not a guess," he said, voice still calm, almost too calm for the tension pressing in from every direction, and that calmness unsettled Lucas more than any raised voice could have because it did not belong in failure. It belonged in certainty, the kind that does not need confirmation. Sir, with respect, we have already run full diagnostics twice, Ryan replied, forcing a thin smile that did not reach his eyes as a few members of the team shifted awkwardly behind him, the earlier laughter fading into something less certain. Everything checks out. He tapped his tablet again, as if the glowing screen would reinforce reality itself. But Ethan's attention had already moved past him, back to the aircraft, to the way the sunlight reflected differently along that single seam, to the faint distortion in the metal that only appeared when the heat bent the light just enough to reveal it. A detail so small it vanished the moment you stopped looking for it. And he stepped forward again, slow, unhurried, each movement measured. You are reading what it tells you, he said quietly. I am. Looking at what it is hiding. And that was when Lucas felt it clearly, a tightening in his chest, the realization that this was no longer about a broken aircraft, but about two completely different ways of understanding the same machine, one built on data and one built on experience, and only one of them seemed unshaken by failure. That panel has no fault indicators, Ryan insisted, louder now, the edge in his voice sharper. Opening it would violate protocol and delay us even more, but even as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward the SUV, because the driver's door had opened, and a figure had stepped out, tall, composed, wearing authority like it was second nature, and the shift in posture among a few senior crew members was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, back straightening, voices lowering, as recognition spread without a single word being spoken. Yet Ethan did not look, did not acknowledge the arrival. His focus remained fixed, his hand lifting slightly toward the panel, but not touching it yet, like he was waiting, not for permission, but for something else to align, something only he seemed aware of. While Lucas took an involuntary step forward, his instincts pulling him closer. To the moment he could not fully explain, the air thickening again, heavier than before, as if everything was about to pivot on a single decision, and behind them, the door of the SUV closed with a soft, deliberate click that somehow carried more weight than any shouted command. No one announced his name, but the shift was immediate, like a current passing silently through every uniform on the tarmac as conversations died mid-sentence and shoulders squared without command. Because Colonel James Whitaker did not need introduction, he carried it with him in the way he walked, steady and controlled, his eyes scanning once across the scene before settling on the aircraft, and then, without hesitation, on Ethan Caldwell. And in that single moment, something invisible locked into place, something Ryan Brooks did not yet understand but could feel slipping beyond his control as he straightened instinctively, tablet lowering just slightly in his grip. Colonel, he began, forcing confidence back into his voice. We have the situation under control, just a minor systems inconsistency. But Whitaker did not answer him, did not even acknowledge the report. His attention remained fixed ahead as he closed the distance with measured steps, the sound of his boots against concrete, quiet but deliberate, each one carrying more authority than the raised voices from moments before, and Lucas felt his pulse quicken because he saw it clearly now. The colonel was not looking at the aircraft the way everyone else had been. He was looking at Ethan, not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with recognition, the kind that comes from memory rather than assumption, and that realization sent a ripple of unease through him as he glanced back at the old man who still stood exactly the same, hand hovering inches from the panel, unmoved by the arrival that had silenced everyone else. Sir, Ryan tried again, a hint of urgency creeping in as the seconds ticked away. We have already confirmed all diagnostics. There is no indication that section needs to be opened. And this time Whitaker stopped, not abruptly, but with a precision that made the entire line of technicians seem suddenly out of place. His gaze shifting briefly to Ryan, sharp, assessing, before returning to Ethan. And when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with it a weight that pressed down on every person within earshot. How long have you been looking at it? He asked. But the question was not directed at Ryan. It was directed at Ethan, and that alone changed everything, because the chain of command had just realigned itself without explanation. Ryan felt it, the subtle but undeniable shift, and for the first time uncertainty broke through his composure. About 2 minutes, Ethan replied, his voice unchanged, steady as if the tension surrounding him belonged to someone else entirely, and Whitaker gave the slightest nod, a motion so small most would have missed it, but Lucas did not, because it was not approval, it was confirmation, like something had just been verified without needing proof. Then that is 2 minutes longer than anyone else needed, the colonel said quietly, and now every eye turned fully toward Ethan, the earlier laughter completely gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier with each passing second. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, to reassert control, to remind everyone of protocols and systems and authority, but the words stalled before they formed, because Whitaker took one final step forward and spoke again, not to the team, not to Ryan, but to Ethan alone. Go ahead. And in those two simple words, the entire structure of control collapsed and reformed around a man no one had taken seriously just moments before, leaving Ryan standing frozen with the tablet still in his hand as Ethan finally moved, his fingers reaching forward with absolute certainty toward the panel that every system had declared perfect. Ethan's fingers settled against the metal with a familiarity that did not belong to guesswork, and for a moment he did nothing, just rested his hand there, as if confirming something deeper than surface measurements, while the entire team watched in a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, and Ryan Brooks felt the weight of that silence pressing against him, because this was no longer his operation in the way it had been minutes ago, the control he had held through procedures and data slipping quietly into the space between what he knew and what he could not explain. "Sir, with respect, we should not be opening that panel without proper authorization," he said, forcing the words out, but they lacked the sharp edge they carried before, dulled now by the presence standing just behind him, and Colonel Whitaker did not respond, did not even shift his stance, his gaze fixed on Ethan with a stillness that suggested this moment had already been decided, long before anyone else understood it, and that realization unsettled Ryan more than any direct order could have, because it meant the outcome was no longer dependent on process, but on something he did not have access to. While Lucas stood just a few feet away, his attention locked on Ethan's hand, noticing the subtle details others missed, the way his fingers traced along the seam, stopping at one bolt that looked identical to the rest, but sat just a fraction of an inch lower, a difference so small it vanished under casual inspection, and Ethan's thumb pressed lightly against it, not turning it yet, just feeling it, like confirming a memory rather than discovering a flaw. And then, without hurry, he reached into the worn leather pouch at his side, the material creasing softly as he opened it, revealing a set of tools that looked out of place among the modern equipment scattered around the tarmac, simple, aged, their edges worn smooth from years of use, and a faint shift passed through the group as a few technicians exchanged glances, the earlier confidence replaced now by something quieter, less certain, because nothing about this felt random anymore. Nothing about it felt like chance, and Ethan selected a small wrench, its metal dull but steady, and fitted against the bolt with a precision that suggested he already knew how it would respond, and as he applied just enough pressure to turn it, the world around him seemed to fall away, the hum of idle generators fading into something older, something distant, where the air was heavier and carried a different kind of weight, the memory rising not as a distraction but as a continuation, the same motion, the same angle, the same quiet urgency of a machine that did not announce its failure but demanded to be understood, and for a fraction of a second his eyes shifted, not unfocused but deeper, like he was seeing through time rather than recalling it, and then he stopped, just before completing the turn, pulling his hand back slightly, as if adjusting for something unseen, something not in the manuals or the diagnostics, but in the rhythm of the machine itself, and Lucas felt it again, that tightening sense that this was not repair, this was recognition, and behind them, Colonel Whitaker finally moved, just one step forward, his voice low but carrying with absolute clarity. "Listen," he said, and it was not a command, it was an instruction, and for the first time, the team did exactly that, the noise of their own assumptions gone, replaced by the faintest difference in the sound of the aircraft, a subtle irregularity buried beneath the stillness. Something that had been there all along but ignored because no system had flagged it, and Ethan nodded once, almost to himself, before setting the wrench again, this time turning it fully, the metal giving way with a soft, decisive click that echoed far louder than it should have in the silence that followed. The bolt turned with a soft resistance that gave way just enough to confirm what Ethan already knew. And as the panel loosened under his hand, a faint shift in the aircraft's presence followed. Not a sound anyone could clearly define, but something that settled differently in the air, like a tension releasing one thread at a time. And Ethan paused again, not rushing forward, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the panel as if listening for permission from the machine itself. While around him no one spoke, no one moved. Even Ryan Brooks stood still now, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet uncertainty he could not hide, his eyes fixed on the simple motion unfolding in front of him, trying to reconcile it with the clean, flawless diagnostics still glowing on his tablet. "There is nothing there," he said. But the words came softer now, less like a command and more like a question he did not want answered, and Ethan did not respond. He simply eased the panel open a few inches, just enough to expose the narrow space behind it, a place no one had thought to check because nothing had told them to, and the heat rising from within carried a slightly different tone, not stronger, not weaker, just wrong in a way that could not be measured, only noticed, and Lucas leaned forward slightly, his breath held without realizing it, his eyes tracing the interior as Ethan reached in carefully, his movements slow and precise, not searching, but going directly to a point hidden deeper inside, his fingers adjusting something small, almost invisible, a connection that sat just out of alignment, not broken, not flagged, but imperfect enough to disrupt everything. And as he made the adjustment, the memory returned fully, not as a distraction, but as a mirror, the same confined space, the same quiet urgency, the same understanding that machines did not always fail loudly. Sometimes they simply drifted out of sync with themselves, and it took someone who had seen that drift before to bring them back. And Ethan withdrew his hand, closing the panel halfway, not sealing it yet, just enough to test what he had corrected, and he stepped back one pace, his posture unchanged, his face calm, as if the outcome was already decided, while Ryan stared at the panel, then at his tablet, then back again. The gap between what he was seeing and what he believed widening with every second. "Run the startup sequence," Colonel Whitaker said quietly, and this time Ryan did not argue, did not hesitate. He simply nodded once and turned, his voice steady but lower than before as he gave the command, and the team moved quickly, their earlier arrogance gone, replaced by a focused silence as switches were engaged and systems cycled, the familiar hum beginning again, low at first, then building, and for a brief moment nothing happened, just the steady rise of expectation, and then the engine responded, not violently, not dramatically, but with a smooth, controlled ignition that carried a different sound than before, cleaner, aligned, the kind of sound that told those who understood it that everything was finally where it needed to be, and Lucas felt it instantly, that subtle but undeniable shift from failure to function, and he glanced at Ethan, who was already reaching down to secure the panel, tightening the bolt with the same quiet precision, as if the success itself required no acknowledgement, while behind him Colonel Whitaker watched without surprise, only a slight exhale marking the release of something long anticipated, and Ryan stood there for a second, longer than necessary, listening to the engine now running as it should have all along, the reality settling in slowly, not through words, but through the absence of everything that had been wrong just moments before. The engine settled into a steady rhythm that rolled across the tarmac like a quiet confirmation, not loud, not dramatic, just right. And that was what made it undeniable, because everyone standing there knew the difference between something that merely worked and something that was truly fixed, and Ryan Brooks felt it in the way the vibration under his boots no longer carried that subtle, uneven pulse he had ignored before, his eyes drifting back to the panel that was now sealed again as if it had never been touched, the evidence of failure erased so completely it almost felt unreal. And for a moment he said nothing, his grip on the tablet loosening slightly as the numbers on the screen continued to insist that everything had always been fine. And that contradiction sat heavier than any mistake, because it meant the system had not been wrong, it had simply been incomplete. And Ethan Caldwell had seen what it could not, while across from him the old man stepped back fully now, slipping the small wrench into the worn leather pouch with the same quiet care he had taken when pulling it out, his movements unhurried, as if the entire sequence had been routine rather than something that had just shifted the entire atmosphere of the operation, and Lucas watched him closely, trying to understand how someone could stand so still in the center of something so significant and treat it like nothing more than another task completed. And it was in that stillness that the realization began to take shape, that whatever Ethan carried was not something learned from manuals or procedures, but something built over time, piece by piece, in places where failure did not announce itself with warning lights or alerts. And behind them, Colonel Whitaker finally exhaled fully, the sound almost lost beneath the hum of the engine, but it marked the end of something, a tension that had been present long before the team even noticed the problem, and he stepped forward once more, stopping just beside Ethan, not in front of him, not above him, but beside him, and that positioning alone carried more meaning than any formal acknowledgement could have. "It never shows up on diagnostics," Whitaker said quietly, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear, but the words carried outward anyway, because the silence around them allowed nothing to be lost. "Not unless you know where to look." And Ryan heard it, every word, and for the first time since the sequence began, he did not feel the need to respond, because there was nothing to defend, nothing to correct, only something to accept, and he nodded once, a small motion, almost to himself, before stepping back half a pace, giving space without being told to, while the rest of the team followed instinctively, their earlier posture replaced by a quiet respect they did not yet fully understand, and Ethan did not react to any of it. He simply looked at the aircraft one last time, his gaze moving across its surface as if confirming that everything was aligned again, and then he turned slightly, preparing to step away, as if his part in the moment had already ended. But before he could take that step, Whitaker spoke. Again, this time just enough for everyone to hear. "They built the system to catch failures," he said, his eyes still on the aircraft. He learned how to hear them before they happen, and the words settled into the space between them, not as praise, but as explanation. And for Lucas, that was the moment everything shifted fully into place, because he understood now that what he had witnessed was not just a repair. It was a different way of seeing entirely, one that did not replace technology, but completed it. And as the engine continued its steady, flawless run, the team stood in a silence that no longer felt heavy, but earned, watching a man who had never raised his voice become the center of something none of them would forget. For a few seconds no one moved, not because they were told to stand still, but because something in the moment demanded it, a quiet recognition settling over the tarmac as the steady hum of the engine filled the space where doubt had been just minutes before, and Ethan Caldwell adjusted the strap of his worn leather pouch like a man finishing a routine task, his attention already drifting away from the aircraft as if the outcome had never been in question, while Ryan Brooks remained where he stood, the tablet now lowered completely at his side, its glowing screen suddenly irrelevant, and he looked at Ethan differently now, not with dismissal, not even with curiosity, but with the kind of focus reserved for something that had just proven itself beyond explanation. And he took a step forward, slow and measured, the earlier edge gone from his posture. "Sir," he began, the word coming out more carefully than before, as if testing its weight. But Ethan did not turn immediately, his gaze still resting on the aircraft for one last second before he finally looked back, his expression unchanged, calm, unreadable, and Ryan hesitated, just briefly, because whatever he had planned to say no longer seemed sufficient, and that hesitation said more than any apology could have, while nearby Lucas Reed stood watching both of them, feeling the shift not just in the situation, but in the people within it. The hierarchy subtly rewritten without orders or announcements, and behind them Colonel Whitaker remained silent, observing, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because this was not something that could be directed, only understood. We ran every check," Ryan said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Everything said it was fine." And Ethan gave a small nod, not dismissive, not critical, just acknowledging the truth in that statement. "It was fine," he replied, his voice low and steady. "Just not aligned." And the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any technical explanation, because it bridged the gap between what the system saw and what it missed, and Ryan absorbed that, his eyes shifting briefly toward the panel again, as if seeing it for the first time, without the filter of data, and Lucas felt something settle in his chest. A realization that this moment would stay with him long after the aircraft had left the ground. Because it was not about the fix, it was about the perspective that made the fix possible. And as the engine continued its smooth, unwavering run, a crew chief in the distance signaled confirmation. The aircraft ready once more for operation. But no one rushed to celebrate. No one broke the silence with relief, because the weight of what had just happened lingered in a different way, quieter, deeper, and Ethan simply nodded once more. A motion that seemed directed at no one in particular. Before turning fully away, his steps unhurried as he began to walk back toward the edge of the tarmac, blending into the space as easily as he had entered it. And for a moment it looked like he might leave without another word, without acknowledgement, without recognition, and that would have been enough for him. But it was not enough for the moment itself, because just as he passed the edge of the gathered team, Colonel Whitaker's voice cut through the air again, not loud, but impossible to ignore. "Ethan," he said, and the name carried with it a familiarity that drew every eye back, including Ryan's, including Lucas's, and Ethan paused, just briefly, his back still turned, the wind catching the edge of his jacket as if holding him in place for one final second, and in that pause the entire team seemed to lean into what came next, not with anticipation, but with a quiet understanding that whatever was about to be said mattered more than anything that had come before. Ethan stopped at the sound of his name, not sharply, not with surprise, but with the kind of pause that comes from recognition rather than interruption, and for a brief moment he did not turn, his posture remaining steady as the wind moved lightly across the tarmac, carrying the steady hum of the engine behind him. And when he finally looked back, it was not toward the team, not toward Ryan or the others who were still trying to process what had just happened, but toward Colonel Whitaker, and something in that glance carried history, not spoken, not explained, but understood, and Whitaker stepped forward one pace, closing the distance just enough that the moment felt intentional. "You always did that," the colonel said, his voice low but clear, and a few of the technicians exchanged quick glances, unsure what exactly he meant, but Lucas felt it again, that sense that there was something deeper beneath the surface, something that did not belong to today alone, and Ethan gave the faintest hint of a nod, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging. "Machines talk," he said quietly, the words simple but delivered with a certainty that made them land heavier than expected, and Whitaker allowed a small breath to pass, almost like a quiet agreement. "And you were always the only one who listened long enough," he replied, and now the silence around them shifted again, not tense this time, but reflective, as if the space itself was holding onto something older than the moment, and Ryan Brooks stood there absorbing every word, his earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet awareness that he had just witnessed something he had never been trained for, something no system or protocol could fully capture. And he looked at Ethan again, this time not searching for answers, but recognizing that the answers were not something that could be handed over, they had to be earned. And that realization settled heavily, but not uncomfortably, more like a recalibration than a failure, while Lucas found himself stepping forward without thinking. Just a small movement, but enough to bring him closer to the edge of the moment, his eyes fixed on Ethan as if trying to hold on to the details before they disappeared, and Ethan noticed him this time. Just a brief glance, but it carried a quiet understanding, the kind that passes without words, and then his gaze moved back to Whitaker. "You still trust instincts over reports," Ethan said, not as a question, but as a statement, and Whitaker gave a slight nod, his expression steady. "Only when they come from someone who has earned them," he replied, and that answer hung in the air, not directed at anyone in particular, but heard by everyone. And for Ryan it landed with a clarity that cut through everything else, because it was not a criticism, it was a standard, one he had not yet reached but now understood existed. And behind them the aircraft continued its flawless run, the mission back on track as if nothing had ever gone wrong. But the team no longer looked at it the same way, because now they knew that perfection on a screen did not always mean perfection in reality, and that gap, however small, mattered, and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the moment already beginning to pass for him. "Take care of her," he said, his voice directed toward no one and everyone at the same time. A quiet instruction rather than a command, and with that he turned again, this time without pause, his steps steady as he moved away from the center of attention he had never asked for, leaving behind a team that stood in a silence no longer filled with doubt, but with something far more lasting, the understanding that what they had just seen could not be replicated by following steps, only by becoming the kind of person who no longer needed them. The sound of the engine continued long after Ethan Caldwell disappeared beyond the edge of the tarmac, steady and unwavering, a quiet testament to something most of them had not understood until it stood right in front of them. And for a long moment no one spoke, not because they were waiting for orders, but because the need for them had faded, replaced by something heavier, something that did not require instruction, and Ryan Brooks stood there with the tablet still in his hand, its screen dimming slowly as the data it displayed lost its authority in his mind, and he looked down at it once more before lowering it completely, his grip relaxing as if letting go of something he had relied on for far too long. And when he lifted his eyes again, they did not return to the aircraft, but to the empty space where Ethan had been standing, as if trying to understand how someone could walk in, change everything, and leave without claiming any part of it. And that question stayed with him longer than the fix itself, while nearby Lucas Reed exhaled slowly, only now realizing he had been holding his breath through most of what had happened, and he glanced at the panel again, now sealed and indistinguishable from the rest of the aircraft. And it struck him how easily the flaw had hidden, how quietly it had existed without demanding attention, and how it had taken someone who was not looking for confirmation, but for truth, to find it. And that difference settled deep, reshaping the way he would look at everything from that moment forward. And behind them, Colonel Whitaker remained still for a few seconds longer before finally turning, his gaze sweeping once across the team, not judging, not correcting, but acknowledging. And when his eyes met Ryan's, there was no disappointment there, only a quiet expectation, the kind that did not lower standards, but raised them. And Ryan nodded once, a small motion, but this time it carried understanding rather than defense. And Whitaker gave the slightest return nod before stepping away, his role in the moment complete just as Ethan's had been, leaving behind a team that now stood in a silence that felt earned rather than imposed. And the mission resumed without fanfare, procedures continuing, systems monitored, tasks completed, but something fundamental had shifted beneath it all, something no checklist could capture. And as the aircraft prepared to move, its engines humming with quiet precision, Lucas found himself looking out toward the far end of the runway where the heat shimmer blurred the horizon, wondering how many moments like this had passed unnoticed before, how many times experience had stood quietly at the edge of a situation, waiting to be recognized. And Ryan stepped forward again, his posture different now, less rigid, more aware, his voice calm as he addressed the team, not with the sharp authority from earlier, but with a measured clarity that reflected what he had just learned. And the technicians responded in kind, their movements more deliberate, their attention sharper, not because they had been corrected, but because they had seen what was possible when something deeper than procedure took over. And as the aircraft finally began to taxi, its movement smooth and controlled, the sound rolling across the tarmac like a quiet affirmation, the moment faded into memory, but not into insignificance, because for those who had been there, it would not be remembered as the day a system failed, but as the day they understood that not everything worth knowing shows up on a screen. And as the heat waves danced across the runway and the sky stretched wide above them, one truth settled in, quiet and permanent: that experience does not need